Ladies and gentlemen, I believe we are ready to begin. If you are.
I am.
Indeed. Fantastic. So first of all, I want to welcome you all here to our third Sun Founder event. And we're delighted to count among our many guests many of our dearest friends and supporters. Thank you for being here, and thank you for what you do for the New York Sun. It's also a special thank you to our hosts, Thomas and Caroline. This is a beautiful environment, befitting the occasion. So thank you for opening your home to us both. Evgeny, you're a dear friend. I consider you a dear friend. We don't talk very often, but I know that we are in line on some key fundamental matters. So I'm very excited to talk with you, for everybody here to get to know you and hear your unique, thoughtful, impassioned and valuable perspective on world events, especially as it relates to the intersection of arts and politics, and of course your own personal experience growing up in the Soviet Union and then starting to understand that there was something better out there. And then of course the world as it is today, and how your experience helps influence your activism and views of how things are evolving. So, as many of you know, I'm just going to share a little bit about Evgeny's background. Evgeny is one of the most prominent pianists on the world stage today. Just over the past couple of weeks, he's had 2 performances in Carnegie Hall, but your first performance was 32 years ago, in 1990. So you've spent more time as a Carnegie Hall performer than as not a Carnegie Hall performer. And obviously your career as a pianist began very, very, very early on as a youngster. But I want to just start with, I know you talk a lot about the piano, and there are a lot of settings where that's the focus, but I want to focus on all of the other stuff for now. One thing that you've recently brought to your performances, which seems unique and interesting and fascinating, is poetry, and specifically poetry and compositions, piano compositions, from forgotten artists. So most recently at Carnegie Hall, you were reading poetry from really Soviet poets, right, who were persecuted and executed in many cases. But a number of years ago, you did the same in terms of compositions from musical composers who were lost during the Holocaust. Is that right?
No. A few days ago, I, together with the famous Russian actor of Jewish descent, Evgeny Kissin, gave an evening of poetry, Jewish poetry and music. We recited poems by famous Soviet Yiddish poets, most of whom were murdered by Stalin 70 years ago. And I played some Jewish music. La Suite Danseuse, the Dance Suite by Alexander Crane, and a fragment from Moisei Weinberg's First Sinfonietta in my own arrangement for piano. A few years ago at Carnegie Hall, I alone gave an evening of Jewish poetry and music. I recited poems by Yitzhak Leibush Peretz and played various pieces of classical Jewish music. Ernest Bloch's Sonata, Crane's Suite Danseuse, and Alexander Veprick's Second Sonata.
Right.
Before that, I performed the same program at Lincoln Center in Washington, D.C., as well as in Dallas, Texas.
So at what stage, I would say, I mean, obviously, you're bringing to the fore what I would call some forgotten artists. I mean, these are artists that would not typically be performed. In some cases, obviously, you have a mix, but artists who would, in most cases, not be played at concert halls like this and on platforms like this. At what stage did you sort of see a responsibility, if you will, to ensure that these artists were not forgotten?
That was an invitation from Charles Krauthammer of blessed memory a few years before his death. He, together with his wonderful wife Robin, launched a series of classical Jewish music at Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C. called Pro-Hebraica series. And they invited me to give a concert as part of those series. That's how it happened.
Right. So that was sort of your entree to discovering some of these artists.
Yes.
Right. No, that's really fascinating.
I had known, even though I had not played it before,
Right.
Bloch's Sonata before, long before, but Crane's and Deprick's pieces I had not known before. I think Bloch's Sonata was at that time the only classical Jewish piece for piano solo that I knew. So I searched a lot and chose the pieces I thought were the best and was performing.
But did Krauthammer ever have the chance to come to one of these performances?
Of course he was there.
Right. So at the...
And he went to my other concerts in D.C.
Right, right. And he knew, obviously, that he was the inspiration behind it.
Well, he invited me to do it.
Right, right. Got that. That's fantastic. How would you describe it? You know, we've discussed this on a few occasions. How would you describe your own view of the world? How would you describe your own politics? And I think specifically, maybe that's the purpose of this book, because we shared you
Yes,
shared a little bit
absolutely.
of this with me about your own political journey. So, you know, growing up in the Soviet Union, maybe share a little bit about your worldview, how you would describe it, and then a little bit about how you came to hold that view.
Well, my worldview is that there are many wonderful things in the world and many bad and even horrible ones as well. This has always been the case, and it looks like it will not be different in any foreseeable future. So here we come to the Jewish idea of tikkun olam, making the world better, which I believe each of one should try to do as much as we can, each one of us in his or her own way. Speaking specifically about politics, I'm Jewish. I was born and grew up in the evil empire. Since early childhood, I was constantly experiencing Russian anti-Semitism, not even the state anti-Semitism, but the daily life one. So even though, of course, there are always good people everywhere, as we know, even some guards in Nazi concentration camps proved to be good people. Of course, in Russia, among ethnic Russians, I met a number of good and wonderful people. Some of them helped me a lot. With some of them who are still alive, I keep close friendship. They have the same worldview as I do, and I cherish my friendship with them a lot. Of course, the same thing applies to my whole family. Having said that, nevertheless, my whole family, all the people of our circle knew perfectly well that we were living in an anti-Semitic country, in an evil state, that the Soviet propaganda was all lies, that the West was a free and prosperous society, that Israel was good and her enemies were bad, that Israel's cause was right. That was clear to all people who were not brainwashed by the official propaganda, no matter whether they were Jewish or not. And by the way, that explains why the Eastern European countries are more pro-Israel than many Western European ones, because their politicians and people knew and know full well from their communist experience that the anti-Zionist propaganda was and is all lies. And even Poland, where anti-Semitism has also been very strong since the beginning of the 20th century, is nevertheless a pro-Israel state. So, of course, we all wanted to get out of that country. We were not even nationalistic minded, so we didn't want to and didn't go to Israel. We just wanted to get out of the barbaric anti-Semitic Russia to the free and civilized West. We actually wanted to live in Western Europe. The problem was that my father, of blessed memory, had a secret job. He was working at a factory which was producing details for rockets.
The tails?
Yes.
Yeah, the flights.
Parts, small parts for rockets. That's why he could not even think of traveling abroad, not even in the so-called socialist countries, meaning in other communist countries, back in Soviet times. But when the Soviet Union collapsed, because the Soviet Union collapsed, he managed for a bribe to get a paper which stated that he had not had access to any secret works, although in reality he had such access. And thanks to that paper, he was able to get a permission to go out of the country. So, we left Russia. We were all very happy. And then I can tell you exactly when it was. I started realizing that something was wrong in the free world as well. It happened at the end of March 2002, when the wave of the anti-Israel hysteria raised its peak all over the free world, with the exception of this country, the United States. Let me recall the earlier development of the events.
That was the
as
second
we know,
Intifada, right?
exactly.
Yeah.
But as we know, in the year 2000, at Camp David, Israel, hoping to make finally achieve peace with the Palestinian Arabs, offered to Yasser Arafat virtually that Israel return to its pre-1967 borders with some minor land swaps in exchange for peace. Arafat rejected that offer and responded with the second Intifada. At first, many people thought that the second Intifada was Ariel Sharon's fault because it started after Sharon went to the Temple Mount on a Friday, which, as we know, is a holy day for the Muslims. But then, as someone from Arafat's own circle admitted, immediately after returning from Camp David in 2000, Arafat had ordered his people to prepare for an Intifada. So, unlike the first Intifada, the second one started not in response to the occupation, but on the contrary, in response to Israel's offer to end the occupation. That's why in the following elections, Ariel Sharon won landslide. But in spite of that, he created a government of national unity, into which he invited his defeated opponents, and Shimon Peres became the foreign minister in his government. So the Intifada continued. Israel naturally continued defending herself, and for some inexplicable, at least for me then, reason, everybody turned against Israel, as if the whole thing was Israel's own fault. I remember very well how I experienced that myself at that time, in the end of March 2002, not only from reading about it in newspapers and seeing anti-Israel demonstrations all over the world on TV, but from a conversation with an acquaintance of mine who, like me, was living in London then, who first spoke out against the war in Afghanistan, which took place after 9/11, putting forward the following argument: if I break your leg, you will not break mine. And then she said that the West should interfere into what's going on in the Middle East.
So what
and
did all this...
to my question, how, she replied as if that was something obvious, to remove Sharon from power.
So what did this
really,
tell you?
I said, and what about Arafat? Should he not be removed from power? To which she said, Arafat, poor man, of course he should go, but Sharon is a criminal.
Yeah. What did it tell you about the West, this experience?
Well,
that you
as I said, that made me realize that something was wrong here as well. But I could not understand why. Okay, let's assume Ariel Sharon was bad, as everybody was saying. But I was thinking, what is he actually doing that Yitzhak Rabin would not have done in the same situation? When the first Intifada began, and again, it began, unlike the second one, indeed in response to the occupation. Yitzhak Rabin called to break arms and legs of stone throwers. During the second Intifada, they were throwing not stones but bombs. So, and again, bearing in mind that that Intifada began in response to Israel's offer to end the occupation, to achieve peace. What was that to accuse Sharon and Israel for? So for a few years I could not understand what was going on. Until I read this book. Well, not exactly this one. This is an English translation of the book written by the late Vladimir Bukovsky. He was one of the most prominent ex-Soviet dissidents. He wrote it back in 1994 in Russian. But for some reason, I did not hear about it back then, and only read it maybe 14, 15 years later. This book consists mainly of documents, not of Bukovsky's own judgments, but of documents from secret Soviet archives, to which Bukovsky managed to get access after the collapse of the Soviet Union. How did that happen? Bukovsky himself tells about it in this book. After the putsch in the Soviet Union in August 1991, Bukovsky came to Moscow, went to various people from Boris Yeltsin's team, and started explaining to them that they should open the secret archives, telling them that communism at that moment was like a wounded beast and it should be killed then, immediately, because if it is not killed a few months later, its wounds would be healed and it would grab them by the throat. Everybody agreed with him except Boris Yeltsin, as well as your, my dear friend, State Department. From this book, it is clear why. So Bukovsky left Moscow thinking that nothing good would happen there. But then his prediction came true. In the spring of 1992, already after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russian communists tried to sue the new Russian government, Yeltsin's government. And then people from Yeltsin's team started telephoning Bukovsky, begging him as a man who had spent 12 years in prisons, labor camps, and psychiatric hospitals under the communist regime, to come to Moscow as a witness during the trial. Bukovsky put forward the following condition: I'll only come, he said, if you open the archives for me. So they agreed. He came, they opened the archives, but now let me read a little bit from the book itself. Where is it? Here. So he managed to get a considerable number of important documents. Here, feeling certain that I would not be able to make any copies, either for lack of a photocopier or because of the necessity of obtaining special permission for every scrap of paper or for God knows what other reasons, I took the precaution of acquiring a miracle of Japanese technology, a portable computer with a handheld scanner. At that time, this piece of technology had only just appeared in the West, and it was completely unknown to our Russian savages. Because of this, I was able to sit right under their noses and scan piles of documents, page after page, with no worries about the curious who kept coming up to admire my machine. Look at that, would exclaim the leaders of the democratic Russia, peering admiringly over my shoulder. Now that must have cost a few bucks. Nobody realized what I was doing until the court hearing was almost over, until December 1992, when one of them suddenly saw the light and yelled loudly enough to be heard a block away, "He's copying everything!" There was a deadly hush. I kept scanning as though I had not heard. "He'll publish everything over there!" I finished working, packed up my computer, and headed calmly for the door, looking neither left nor right. From there, he went immediately to the airport and flew back to England, where he was living. Now, the book is called, as you can see, Judgment in Moscow, and the subtitle is Soviet Crimes and Western Complicity. When I read it in the original Russian, it became a revelation to me, and it explained to me what exactly was wrong in the West and why. Of course, the Soviet crimes were no revelation for me. The revelation for me was the Western complicity, its extent, the fact that it had been taking place for decades. And sadly, it continues to take place up to this day.
Can you elaborate?
Of course, I shall elaborate, and I shall allow myself, if you allow me to do so, to quote a few passages from this book, to read a few passages from this book. By the way, it was immediately published in the original Russian, in French, in German, in some Eastern European languages, but not in English. It was published in English only 4 years ago, and I think I can say that I gave some help for it to be translated into English and published, because I thought and still think that it is of extreme importance and should be read by everyone who cares about liberty, freedom, and democracy. So,
so let's talk a little bit.
In this new version of the book, Bukovsky told why it had not been published in English back in 1990s. But first, let me read a few passages from it. In the very beginning, Bukovsky writes about the huge pile of those secret documents lying in front of him, and then he says, some 3 or 4 years ago, every one of these papers would have fetched hundreds of thousands of dollars. He wrote the book in 1993. Today, I offer them free of charge to the most influential newspapers and journals in the world, but nobody wants to print them. Editors shrug indifferently. So what, who cares? Only a few years ago, all that is set out in these papers was hotly denied, rated at best as anti-communist paranoia, at worst as slander. Any one of us who dared, in those not so distant times, to mention the hand of Moscow was immediately castigated in the press and accused of McCarthyism and became a pariah. Even those disposed to believe us would raise deprecating hands. All this is guesswork, assumption, there is no proof. Well, here is the proof, signed and numbered, available now for analysis, study, discussion. Take it, check it, print it. And the answer I get is, so what, who cares? Naturally, there are already numerous theories to explain this puzzle. People are tired of the Cold War's tensions, I'm told. They don't want to hear any more about this. They simply want to get on with their lives, work, rest, and forget this whole nightmare. Too many communist secrets have appeared on the market at one time, I hear from others. And from yet another school of thought, the thing to do is wait until all this becomes history. At the moment, it's still politics. But somehow I find none of these explanations convincing. One may say that by 1945, people were tired of the Second World War and of Nazism to the same degree. But this did not serve to impede a cascade of books, articles, and films on the subject. Indeed, an entire industry of anti-fascist productions came into being, and understandably so. The need to fathom that which has just occurred is much more acute than the need to gain insight into events further removed historically. People need to comprehend the meaning of events in which they have had to play a part, to evaluate their sacrifices and efforts, to draw conclusions for the edification of posterity. This is an attempt to prevent the repetition of past errors, and at the same time a kind of collective therapy to heal the wounds of the past. Undoubtedly, admitting the truth about recent events is always a painful process, at times even scandalous, because the participants in yesterday's drama are usually still alive, and in some cases even continue to play a prominent public role in the lives of their country. But when have considerations like these ever restrained the press? On the contrary, a juicy political scandal, which may be deadly to someone, is only fodder for the press, like a snake to a mongoose. So why has our mongoose suddenly grown so timid? And then Bukovsky starts giving specific examples, or a few of which I would like to recite.
We don't have a lot more time left.
No, only a few of which.
We have some, but I also want to get to some really current issues.
Okay, but they will explain.
Okay, yeah. So
on my view, the current issues.
Okay, fantastic.
Okay, right in front of me lies a document concerning a person I have never met, about whom I never knew anything, but who, it emerges, is well known both in his own country and in international political circles. Moreover, it appears that he could have become the president of Finland. The title of the document is not exciting. On measures connected with the 50th birthday of the chairman of the Social Democratic Party of Finland, K. Sorsa. Nor was the text of the resolution adopted by the Secretariat of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union on the 16th of December 1980 particularly interesting. It instructed the Soviet ambassador in Helsinki to pay Kalevi Sorsa a visit with birthday greetings and to present him with a gift on behalf of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Possibly the seeming innocence of this particular paper explains why I got it so easily, without any fuss or bother, from the Central Committee archive. The puzzling thing was that it was marked top secret. This aroused my curiosity. Why should a decision to convey birthday greetings to the leader of the largest political party in a neighboring neutral country, a former prime minister, be shrouded in such secrecy? So I started digging deeper in order to obtain supplementary documents to this resolution of the Central Committee. After all, it made its resolutions on the basis of various reports and recommendations. Nothing was ever done just like that. And finally, after many attempts and stratagems that I won't detail, I got hold of the materials I was after, or rather, a report by the International Department of the Central Committee, 11th of December 1980. I reproduce it here in full. Secret. Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, on measures connected with the 50th birthday of the chairman of the Social Democratic Party of Finland, K. Sorsa. On the 21st of December 1980, the chairman of the Social Democratic Party of Finland, SDPF, K. Sorsa, celebrates his 50th birthday. In his party and governmental activities as Prime Minister, Minister of Foreign Affairs, and Chairman of the Parliamentary Committee on Foreign Affairs, Sorsa consistently maintains positions friendly to the USSR and the CPSU, promotes the development of Soviet-Finnish relations, and fosters stable contacts between the SDPF and our party. On the international scene, first and foremost in the Socialist International, Sorsa, in confidential collaboration with us, works for détente, for the limitation of the arms race, and for disarmament. In view of the above, and the circumstance of Sorsa's election as one of the vice chairman of the Socialist International at its last Congress, where Saucer will continue to coordinate the activities of this organization on matters of détente and disarmament, and bearing in mind his contacts with other political forces, we deem it worth instructing the Soviet ambassador in Finland to congratulate Saucer on his 50th birthday and to present a gift. Draft of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union resolution, appended Deputy Head of the International Department of the CCCPSU, A. Cherняев, 11th of December, 1980. Unquote. Clearly, the above information is not unimportant, and for Finland it is sensational. It shows that a man who declared his candidacy for the post of President of Finland in 1992 engaged in confidential collaboration with an enemy power while holding the posts of Prime Minister, Minister of Foreign Affairs, and leader of the largest political party. Oh. It is not unlikely, moreover, that he was Moscow's man in the Socialist International, where as Vice President he would have exercised enormous influence. Let us recall that period, the last contortions of the Cold War. European streets teeming with Moscow-inspired peace demonstrations protesting against NATO plans to site medium-range nuclear missiles in Europe. At the center of the campaign, European socialists and social democrats, many of them in the governments of their own countries, or at least leaders of the main opposition forces. And in the center of that center, Saucer, who coordinated the Socialist International's activities on matters of détente and disarmament while confidentially collaborating with the Communist Party of the Soviet Union on these very issues. Not bad, is it? One would think that a piece of information such as this would be a treasure trove for the Finnish press in the run-up to the presidential election. But no. More than 6 months passed after this document was offered to the largest newspapers in Finland with no result. So what? Who cares? It was only half a year later, thanks to the efforts of some of my friends, that the document finally made the papers in Finland, and Mr. Saucer, after a public scandal, withdrew his candidacy. I can find no explanation for such a state of affairs. I am told that people are tired of the Cold War, that they do not want to know about that very recent past. But is it the task of the press to decide what the public should or should not know about their future president? Surely the press has a duty to inform the public and then let the public decide what it needs or does not need to know. There's no doubt that if the information had concerned a purely president's love affair or some petty corruption, it would have made front-page headlines in every Finnish newspaper. And then Bukovsky makes a very interesting comparison. It is interesting to recall how several years earlier a grandiose scandal erupted in another neutral European country, Austria. It became known that presidential candidate Kurt Waldheim had some 50 years ago collaborated confidentially with the Nazis as a mere junior officer. And although the electorate chose to ignore this fact, the Austrian press was full of the matter down to the smallest detail. Indeed, the whole world raised a storm of protest, and the world press covered it as an event of primary importance. The strange thing is, however, that in this instance, nobody thought to say, so what, who cares? It could be argued, of course, that Finland is a special case and that the term Finlandization is no accident, that in actual fact the whole country could be said to have collaborated confidentially with Moscow. For Finland, this is no crime and no sensation. And what else could be said from a small neutral country that has to live side by side with the big grey brother? But Norway is also a neighbor, and it did not Finlandize. Geography is not the crucial factor. The term Finlandization was not coined in Finland, but in West Germany, by no means a neutral country, and one that, unlike Finland, the West felt obligated to defend. But it was in West Germany that this process took root and flourished. Yet even Germany, despite a readiness to open the Stasi archives, stopped short of putting Erich Honecker on trial, no doubt because it was feared that he would make good on his threat to reveal a whole host of interesting stories. Nobody is particularly keen to dig deeper into the origins of Ostpolitik, to re-evaluate it or to take a new look at the past activities of such public figures as Willy Brandt and Egon Bahr, even though there is much that deserves closer scrutiny. Take, for example, these documents, the 9th of September, 1969.
So let's pause because I want to get to a few other things and we want to wrap up. But I think this is fascinating.
Would you like me to read why the book was not published in English?
I think we need to send everybody a copy of the book. And I think this is the picture that you're painting is fascinating. But I think what everybody is really curious to hear about is how much of this carries, because today we have a situation where the leader of Russia may be looking to recreate the Soviet Union, right, or something like that, and he's thrown the world into turmoil. So the thing
is that it all could have been prevented. So even the annexation of the Crimea could have been prevented. Even as Bukovsky proves in this book, the Soviet Union, communism could have collapsed much earlier had the West not pursued the disgraceful policy of the so-called détente. If we have time, I would be very happy to read a few pages about that particular policy, about Bukovsky's conversations with various important figures in the West, including this country, and with ordinary people. But if we have no time, well, let me say one thing. We started from Israel.
Yeah.
Now, since this book was published only 4 years ago, Bukovsky did not include in it the epilogue of the original Russian version, written, as I have already mentioned, back in 1994. That epilogue was about the situation at that time in Russia and in the West. And one of the passages of that epilogue really shocked me. Back in 1994, Vladimir Bukovsky, a Gentile, wrote the following. I'll quote from memory. In the Middle East, the so-called peace process has already acquired all the traits of a growing calamity. It has already cost Israel more lives than the country lost during the entire Six-Day War. What else could be expected from a peace process secretly concocted in Norway by the international socialist nomenclatura? But the consequences are going to be even more serious. Try to stop a terrorist now, when before each one of them shines Yasser Arafat's example. If you have enough guts to keep killing people for a long time, then you become no longer a terrorist, but a Nobel Peace Prize winner. Have no doubts this will not remain unnoticed neither by Hamas, nor by the IRA, or by the different groups fighting in Bosnia. After I read that, of course, I was shocked. I remember those times, the beginning of that so-called peace process, the first years after the first Oslo Accords was signed. If a Jew had written or said something like that, he or she would have been considered a reactionary, an enemy of peace. But those lines were written by a non-Jew who happened to me to be more intelligent than many Jews. And so I just realized from this book that the Western ideals, the Western principles, the Western ideology on one hand, and most Western politicians public figures, establishment on the other hand, were not one and the same thing, and that unfortunately for decades the latter was betraying the former. And that detente with the USSR and all those various attempts of restarting the relations with Putin's Russia, i.e. with Putin, with Putin's dictatorial regime, they explain, on my view, why the West does not let its natural ally, Israel, the only democracy in the Middle East, to properly defend herself and to fight her enemies. Why Western politicians have been for decades pushing Israel to make concessions to her enemies, even though in the case of the Palestinian Arabs, it is clear to all who have been following the events carefully and seeing with open eyes things the way they have really been, to all of us. It's obvious that in the case of the Palestinian Arabs, since 1993, Israeli concessions were only increasing the terrorism, not diminishing it. But why not, since the West itself mostly pursues the Chamberlain policy of appeasing dictators and murderers.
So I want to finish with this. There's so much to discuss, and this is fascinating, but everybody's waiting for dinner, so I want everyone to have a chance to eat. But
so let me say let me everyone.
This is a book that we got to read, but I want to ask you one final question to tie everything together.
Yes.
Okay? You have presented an incredible picture, taking us through, the last decades to get an understanding of, let's call it, Western complicity with terrorism of different forms. Today we're seeing the terrorism of Vladimir Putin in Ukraine disrupting the world order.
Yes.
What Western complicity do you see today that is allowing this to take place?
Actually, today I've learned the news that now Germany, France, Italy and Hungary are calling for negotiations with Putin. But they are not sending weapons to Ukraine. that needs them so badly. I have learned this news exactly today.
Right. And do you see this as a product of the type of relationships that are outlined here? Is it
The type of mentality
the mentality?
that is outlined here.
Corruption or ideological corruption?
Corruption, both. Both. Absolutely.
And we'll finish with this. What do you see?
We'll see if we are still alive, what we'll find out. Well, of course, Putin's regime will fall sooner or later. And if it so happens that by any chance the Russian secret archives of our times are open again, we'll see what we'll learn from them.
And in the meantime,
I'm sure we'll learn a lot.
and in the meantime, as an artist, you see it as a responsibility to speak up.
Not as an artist, as a human being.
As
We're
a
all
human
human
being.
beings. It doesn't matter whether we are artists, or businessmen, I don't know, workmen, peasants, or whatever.
But you have a platform.
Okay, let's call it this way.
Well, I can say
Since Soviet times, it was clear to me and to all the people of my circle that freedom and democracy were sacred. And by the way, it was also clear to us back then. Bukovsky, by the way, described that in either his first or his second book, how Soviet people who had brains, who had enough brains not to believe the state propaganda, were reading Soviet newspapers. For example, when Soviet newspapers were saying things like, even such a bourgeois and unfriendly newspaper as the New York Times has to admit that, or the Guardian newspaper, which cannot be suspected of sympathies towards communism, admits that, and so forth. The Soviet people are thinking, damn them, and they are called bourgeois and unfriendly.
what did they write about the New York Sun?
In Russia, I honestly don't know. But,
We'll have to
you know,
check. We'll have to check.
now with the internet, there are many sources of information in Russian. And although many internet resources are forbidden in Russia now, people can register. There is a special thing, I don't know, maybe a special device,
Right.
which makes it look like they live not in Russia but in some other country.
Yeah.
And in that way they are able to use Facebook, which is now also forbidden in Russia,
VPN.
and
Yeah.
yes, you know, and read sources of information which are forbidden.
Evgeny, we could sit and listen to you for many, many more hours. We appreciate this fascinating overview, drawing the lines between
We are
your
sitting here
experience.
comfortably, and people in the Ukraine are being killed and raped, even children. And now,
But I think you've helped us understand.
interestingly enough, the same, or some of the same countries,
Yeah.
which behaved so badly during World War II, Germany, Italy, Hungary, and France, which, as we know, during World War II was comme ci, comme ça. As they say in French, now they are calling for negotiations with Putin.
You've helped us, Evgeny, understand our responsibilities, and for
I
that,
would like to hope so.
for that we appreciate you. So thank you for coming.
My pleasure,
we'll-
and
we will
please-
continue the conversation.
Please read the books. Vladimir Bukovsky, Judgment in Moscow, published by 9th of November Press.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Dovid.
Stick around.